In the winter of 1781, as storms brewed over the vast Atlantic, an old, creaking slave ship named the Zong began its passage into infamy. The vessel moved slowly, its warped hull groaning under the weight of more than 400 enslaved Africans, far more than the ship had ever been built to carry. Inside the suffocating darkness below deck, bodies were pressed together so tightly that breathing felt like a struggle against the air itself. Sweat, fear, and hopelessness clung to the timbers like a second skin. The ship's owners had gambled on a deadly equation: more people meant more profit. But that gamble pushed the Zong far past its limits. Everything about this voyage, its overcrowding, its rationing, its navigation, even its purpose, was driven by one thing: greed, a greed so cold and calculating that it would soon justify the unthinkable. What began as a voyage for wealth would unravel into one of the most horrifying acts ever committed at sea. A moment when human beings were reduced to numbers on a ledger. When the officers believed that the lives shackled below them were not lives at all, but cargo, interchangeable, insurable, disposable. As days turned into weeks, the ship drifted deeper into the Atlantic, water supplies ran low, and paranoia began to fester among the crew. Whispers of desperation circled the deck. But the Africans, terrified, starving, trapped in darkness, had no idea that the real danger was not the ocean, nor disease, nor thirst. It was the men who commanded the ship. What happened next would stain British history forever. Over a period of days, enslaved men, women, and children were dragged from the hold and thrown alive into the ocean, their screams swallowed by waves that carried no mercy. They were not dying. They were not sick. They were not beyond saving. They were thrown overboard because someone believed an insurance payout was worth more than their survival. This tragedy, this calculated massacre, would send shockwaves through courts, newspapers, and abolitionist circles across Britain, eventually fueling a movement that challenged the very foundation of the transatlantic slave trade. But before the outrage, before the legal battles, before the cries for justice, there was only terror, unfolding under a bleak sky, over waters that mirrored the ship's dark intentions. To understand how it happened, we must go back to the beginning, back to the start of the Zong's dark journey. The Zong's nightmare did not begin at sea. It began on the African coast, where fear already hung heavy in the air. Dozens of raids had swept through villages, tearing people from their homes, ripping families apart in moments of chaos and confusion. Those who survived the violence were marched for miles under the blistering sun, chained neck to neck, wrists raw from iron shackles rubbing into skin. By the time they reached the shoreline, the sight of the ships waiting offshore, massive, towering beasts of wood, brought little hope. Many had heard rumors of these vessels. Some believed they were being taken to a land of spirits. Others believed they would be eaten. All understood one thing: the world they knew had ended. When they were forced onto the Zong, the reality deepened. The ship's deck was loud, creaking ropes, shouting crewmen, the crash of waves against the hull, but the hold beneath was something else entirely. A suffocating cavern carved into the belly of the vessel, with barely enough room for a grown man to sit upright. The air felt thick, wet, and stale, as if it were clinging to their lungs. Chains rattled every time someone shifted even an inch. The ship was loaded far beyond its designed capacity. More than 400 Africans, stripped of dignity, identity, and hope, were forced down into a space meant for half that number. They were stacked shoulder to shoulder, thigh to thigh, unable to stretch, unable to turn. Some lay on planks slick with sweat and blood. Others pressed against the wooden beams until splinters embedded in their skin. Above deck, the crew bragged about the voyage's potential profit. Below deck, human beings struggled simply to breathe. Disease had no barriers. The stench of vomit, urine, and feces clung to the walls. The groans of the sick echoed through the darkness, mixing with quiet prayers whispered in native tongues, begging ancestors to intervene, begging gods to bring an end to their suffering, begging sleep to be merciful. But sleep was rarely kind. Night after night, the hull magnified every wave, every shift of wood, making the darkness feel alive and restless. Rats scurried across ankles. Insects crawled over wounds that could not heal. Many wondered if death would come, and if it did, whether it would be a blessing. Yet even in this horror, small signs of resistance survived. Mothers hummed lullabies to calm terrified children. Elders recited stories to remind the youngest among them of who they were before chains tried to erase them. And in stolen moments of silence, strangers clasped hands, forming silent bonds of survival. But soon, even these fragile moments would be drowned out. As the Zong creaked farther from the African coast and deeper into open waters, the first signs of something far more dangerous began to appear, not from the ocean but from the ship's officers themselves. For in their eyes, the hold was not filled with people. It was filled with property. And property could be disposed of. The darkest days were coming. When greed became God. The Zong had been at sea for several weeks when the first signs of trouble appeared, small at first, almost invisible. A miscalculated turn, a misread chart, a misplaced assumption about longitude. The ocean was wide and the Caribbean islands were not yet in sight, though they should have been. The crew whispered uneasily, glancing at their navigational instruments and scratching their heads at star maps that suddenly seemed unfamiliar. But Captain Luke Collingwood, feverish and increasingly delirious, insisted they were on the right path. He was a man already weakened by sickness, a former surgeon with limited experience at sea, now entrusted with the lives of more than 400 enslaved Africans, and the financial interests of wealthy investors in Liverpool. Below deck, the captives knew nothing of navigation, but they sensed something was wrong. The ship moved in strange patterns. The wind shifted, yet direction never seemed to change. The crew grew impatient, irritable, and suspiciously silent. And worst of all, the rations began to shrink. Water was life aboard a slave ship. Every drop counted. But the barrels, once heavy and full, had begun to run low. Mistakes had been made. Grievous mistakes. Some barrels had been left uncovered during a heavy squall, salt water creeping in and rendering the contents undrinkable. Others had been tapped too quickly in the early days of the voyage. And as the ship drifted further off course, the journey stretched longer than planned. Soon, the grim truth became impossible to ignore. The Zong was running out of water. Crewmen gathered in small circles, whispering arguments under their breath. Some blamed Collingwood. Others blamed the first mate for misreading the coastline. A few muttered darkly that the enslaved people below were to blame, breathing too much, consuming too much, existing too much. The logic of cruelty was simple and always convenient. Above deck, tension thickened like storm clouds. Below deck, suffering deepened. The enslaved men and women could feel the shift even if they could not understand the language. They received less water, smaller portions of food. Some days barely any at all. Their lips cracked. Their throats burned. The air grew even more suffocating as dehydration tightened its grip. Children cried without tears, because there were no tears left to give. Mothers tried to soothe them with dry whispers. The elderly slipped into delirium. Young men, desperate and parched, licked condensation from the walls. Whispers began to spread among the crew that death was inevitable if something wasn't done. But not the death of the crew, that was never in question. In their minds there were two groups aboard the Zong, those who mattered and those who didn't. And then came the moment everything changed. During a tense officers' meeting, Captain Collingwood revealed a cold, calculating idea. An idea rooted not in survival but in profit. In the twisted logic of the transatlantic slave trade, enslaved people were insured as cargo. If they died of natural causes, there would be no compensation. But if they were jettisoned, thrown overboard due to a necessity, the owners back in Britain could claim financial reimbursement. So Collingwood proposed a solution forged from greed and cruelty. They would throw human beings overboard. Not randomly, not in anger, but methodically, deliberately, as a business decision. Even some of the crew recoiled at first. The idea was monstrous, unspeakable. But the captain pressed on with feverish authority. He claimed that without drastic action, none of them would survive. He insisted that the insurance payout would protect the ship's owners, and by extension, protect their livelihoods. Piece by piece, moral resistance crumbled beneath the weight of greed and fear. By the time dusk fell that evening, the decision had been made. The enslaved Africans below deck had no voice in the matter. No warning. No chance. The crew prepared the ropes. The ocean rolled dark and indifferent alongside the ship. A new storm gathered on the horizon. And the Zong sailed steadily toward its darkest chapter. Night fell over the Atlantic like a shroud, heavy and unmoving, as the Zong creaked through the dark waters. Lightning flickered in the distance, illuminating the waves in silver flashes. The wind moaned through the rigging, carrying with it an eerie sense of foreboding. Something terrible was coming. Below deck, the enslaved Africans lay chained in suffocating silence. Many were too weak to whisper. Others clung to thin threads of hope, hoping land would appear soon, hoping this suffering had an end. They had endured storms, starvation, and sickness. They had endured days with barely a sip of water. Yet still they breathed, still they waited. They did not know that above them, the crew had already decided their fate. The next morning the order was given. A group of sailors descended into the hold, carrying torches that cast long, flickering shadows across the packed bodies. Their boots thudded heavily on the wooden boards. Their faces were cold, unreadable, hardened by days of whispered plotting. At first, the captives recoiled in fear. They had seen brutality before. They had seen floggings, restraints tightened, bodies dragged away for punishment. But this time the sailors said nothing. They simply reached down, unshackled a group of chained Africans and forced them toward the ladder. Some captives hesitated, their instincts screaming danger. Others pleaded in languages the sailors did not understand, their hands trembling, their eyes begging for mercy. Mothers wrapped their arms around their children, refusing to let go. Young men resisted with what little strength hunger had left them. The sailors responded with brute force. Bodies were pulled apart. Fists flew. Clubs cracked against bones. And one by one, terrified men, women, and children were dragged onto the deck, blinking against the sudden sunlight, gasping for air they had not felt in weeks. The ocean spread before them, vast and merciless. Captain Collingwood stood watching, pale and sickly but resolute. His decision had been made. His eyes fixed not on the people being dragged toward the railings, but on the horizon, as though refusing to acknowledge the humanity of those about to die. The first victim, a young woman barely more than a girl, was pulled toward the side of the ship. She screamed in sheer terror, kicking and clawing at the planks beneath her feet. Her voice rose high above the wind, piercing the morning air. She cried out for her mother, for her homeland, for anyone who might save her. But the sailors showed no hesitation. They lifted her by the arms and legs. And with no more emotion than if they were discarding broken crates, they threw her into the sea. Her scream disappeared instantly beneath the roar of the waves. The ocean swallowed her whole. A hush fell across the deck, a momentary chilling stillness, broken only by the creak of the mast and the slap of waves against the hull. And then, as if some invisible line had been crossed, the killing continued. One by one they were dragged forward. A middle-aged man who had tried to shield two younger boys. A mother holding her infant so tightly the crew had to pry her fingers apart. A boy no older than 12, shaking uncontrollably as he begged in a voice the sailors pretended not to hear. Some captives fought savagely. Not out of hope, but out of instinct, the desperate refusal to surrender life. They kicked, bit, screamed, and even managed to land blows on their captors. But hunger and dehydration had weakened their bodies too much. They were no match for armed sailors. Others did not fight at all. Some walked forward silently, as though accepting that this world had no more mercy left for them. A few prayed softly. Some stared blankly into the distance. And some simply collapsed, unable to stand. All met the same fate. Thrown alive into the Atlantic. The water splashed up in cold bursts each time another body hit the surface. The waves carried voices, cries of terror, gasps for air, desperate splashing, as dozens fought to stay afloat, their chains weighing them down. A few managed to break the surface again and again, calling out in agony. Others sank immediately, pulled into darkness by iron shackles. The sea churned with motion, as though resisting the brutal offering forced upon it. But the crew did not look down. Their faces were tight, their mouths thin, their eyes fixed straight ahead. They counted the bodies, not as human casualties, but as numbers to record for insurance claims. 30, 60, 80, more. Day after day the killings continued. The enslaved Africans learned to recognize the sound of approaching footsteps. When the latch to the hold rattled, when the beam creaked beneath boots, when the sailors descended with ropes. They huddled tightly together, trembling with each new group taken. Some tried to hide behind others, pressing against the walls. Some tried to wedge themselves between larger men. Some tried to make themselves small, invisible. But no one was invisible. Crew members dragged them out in batches. Men first, then women, then children. On certain mornings, the killings happened in sunlight. On others, beneath cloudy skies. On some days, storms raged around the ship, lightning splitting the sky as bodies were cast into the heaving sea. The captain claimed it was necessary. He claimed it was for the survival of the ship. He claimed it was justified by law and custom. But necessity did not look like desperation. It looked like routine. Calculated. Cold. Relentless. And still, the water never ran out. By the time the killings ended, more than 130 people had been murdered, thrown alive into the Atlantic, erased from existence by men who valued money more than human life. The waves eventually calmed. The ship continued on its path. Silence settled like ash across the deck. But the screams of those who died did not vanish. They would echo far beyond the ocean. They would reach courtrooms. They would reach abolitionist papers. They would reach a world ready to confront the monstrous truth of the slave trade. But on that deck in that moment, all that remained was the terrible stillness of a crime the ocean could never wash away. When the killings finally ceased, the Zong drifted forward as if nothing had happened, its sails catching the warm Caribbean winds while the ocean behind it churned with the memory of the lives it had swallowed. Days passed, and the crew walked the deck in a tense and unnatural silence. Some tried to push the events out of their minds. Others justified them with the same cold logic that had allowed the murders to happen in the first place. Not one sailor marked a grave, spoke a prayer, or acknowledged the truth. By the time Jamaica's coastline emerged in the distance, lush, radiant, and alive, the ship carried no visible sign of the horror that had taken place. The sun shone brightly as though indifferent, throwing glitter across the waves as the vessel approached the harbor. The few surviving captives, weak and traumatized, were brought ashore. They were thinner, quieter, their eyes hollow from the nightmares they had lived through. There were fewer of them than anyone expected. Merchants in the port took note. A ship of the Zong's size should have arrived with many more enslaved people. Some assumed disease had ravaged the human cargo. Some suspected misfortune or chaos. But the truth, so monstrous, so calculated, could not be imagined by even the most seasoned slave traders. No rumor, no whisper, no explanation could capture what had been done. And so the crew moved forward, filing paperwork, submitting the insurance claim as though they were requesting compensation for damaged goods, not lost human lives. They stated plainly that 133 enslaved Africans had been jettisoned, implying necessity, painting the massacre as a regrettable but permissible act of maritime emergency. They wrote it with clean handwriting, with routine detachment, as if recording the disposal of spoiled cargo. But the insurance company did not accept their story so easily. There were inconsistencies, too many. Why had none of the sailors succumbed to thirst? How could there have been a dire water shortage if the ship continued sailing for days after the killings? Why were so many people thrown overboard in separate batches across multiple days, instead of in one desperate moment of survival? The underwriters sensed deception and they refused to pay. That refusal would become the first crack in the wall of silence surrounding the tragedy. The ship's owners in Liverpool, fueled by pure greed, sued the insurance company. Had they not done so, the story of the Zong might have vanished beneath the waves, forgotten by history. But litigation required testimony, and testimony required truth, at least enough truth to expose the outline of the horror. And so, in a courtroom in London, the massacre resurfaced. What unfolded was not a trial for murder, because in the eyes of British law, enslaved Africans were not recognized as victims. They were regarded as property, and the court was asked to decide whether property had been justifiably destroyed. The legal question was grotesquely simple. Was the insurance company obligated to compensate the ship's owners for the enslaved Africans they had thrown alive into the sea? In this cold environment of ledgers and clauses, someone in the gallery recognized the deeper horror. His name was Olada Equiano, a formerly enslaved African who had earned his freedom. As he listened, understanding every detail of the coded language and euphemisms, he realized the immensity of what had happened. He carried this information to Granville Sharp, a fierce abolitionist who refused to let the tragedy remain a private dispute between businessmen. Sharp pushed the case into public consciousness. He published accounts. He rallied supporters. He made certain that the British public would hear what had been done aboard the Zong. He forced the nation to stand before its own reflection. Pamphlets circulated through cities and towns. Churches preached sermons condemning the cruelty. Abolitionist groups grew louder, citing the massacre as proof that the slave trade was not merely immoral, it was barbaric. People who had never given the trade a second thought suddenly found themselves confronted with its darkest truth. Human beings, terrified and alive, had been thrown into the ocean because someone believed their deaths were financially convenient. During the final hearing, the judge made a statement that trembled with significance. He refused the insurance claim, noting that if the killings resulted from the master's negligence, then the owners could not be compensated. It was not a declaration of murder, but it was an acknowledgement of unjustifiable cruelty, one that carried weight far beyond that courtroom. The owners lost their money. But what mattered more was that they lost their anonymity. The Zong massacre became a national scandal. A wound in public consciousness. A spark that helped ignite one of the most powerful abolition movements in history. The story traveled from London streets to Parliament halls, where William Wilberforce referenced the killings vividly, forcing lawmakers to confront the horror head-on. It became impossible to dismiss the trade as a distant necessity or an unfortunate economic reality. The Zong exposed the truth. Greed had become a god, and human lives were its sacrifice. Years later, the momentum fueled in part by this case contributed to the Slavery Abolition Act of 1807, which outlawed the British slave trade. The deaths of those aboard the Zong did not save themselves, but they became part of a chain reaction that changed the course of history. And yet, the victims had no graves, no names recorded, no monuments on land. Their resting place is the Atlantic itself, where waves roll endlessly over the unmarked graves of millions taken by the Middle Passage. But their story lives. Their voices, stolen in screams swallowed by the sea, still echo in the conscience of humanity. Their suffering continues to remind us of how far humanity can fall, and how essential it is that we never allow such darkness to be forgotten. Their truth remains. Their memory endures. And the ocean, even centuries later, has not forgotten them. If you've stayed with this story until now, if you've listened, learned, and felt the weight of what happened aboard the Zong, then don't let their memory vanish into silence. Join Hidden Tales. Subscribe, share, and follow this channel, so together we can continue to uncover the buried stories that shaped our world, honor the forgotten voices of history, and shine a light where darkness once reigned. Your support ensures that these hidden truths are never lost again.